You might think it a bit of a surprise for the Bank of England to be talking about some of these issues, but actually it's at the heart of what we do. Climate scientists have been clear for many years now that the levels of carbon in our atmosphere are unprecedented, that global average temperatures are increasing and sea levels are continuing to rise. What we have also been clear about at the Bank of England, though, is that climate change is not just an issue for governments and the environment, but it's one that has significant financial consequences that arise from the physical impacts of climate change, whether they're hurricanes, floods, or droughts, but also the transition to a zero carbon economy. Climate change, therefore, matters for our objectives as a central bank. These financial risks from climate change are distinctive, and they require a different approach if we are to manage them effectively. First, these risks are far-reaching in their breadth and in their scope. They will affect all customers, all geographies, all industries. Their impact will be correlated. The effects will be non-linear. Together, that means that these challenges, these risks are likely to occur on a much greater scale than other types of risks. Secondly, these risks are eminently foreseeable. I can't tell you now exactly what will happen and when, a bit like I couldn't tell you what happens with the B word. But what I can say, as this chart of possible carbon pathways highlights, with a high degree of certainty that we will face some risk. Either we carry on our current trajectory of carbon emissions and we will see the physical effects of climate change, or we start to change that trajectory of carbon emissions, and in which case we see the transition risks. In all states of the world, we need to address risk, we just don't know which one.
I would like to give you a perspective of government and how government views these issues. So I think as Sarah, Susan and other speakers have said, we live in an unprecedented time of change, both political, technological, economic, environment, and socially. And then essentially what we're talking about is system change. We need to think about, as Dame Susan described, the three legs of the stool. For us in government, that's economic, social, and environmental. And that any change that we have can be driven across those three pillars. I wanted to say a little bit about the approach to government in Scotland, which links to the SDGs and is rooted in a framework based on a national performance framework, which essentially is an outcomes-based framework. It was introduced in Scotland in 2007, and essentially it recognises that to achieve outcomes, you have to drive the whole system. The outcomes are interdependent on each other, and that it takes a different form of government. It takes a different type of approach. So that's very much embedded in Scotland. It was introduced in 2007, and I'll say how it's developed over that period very, very briefly. But essentially, the 11 outcomes that are there are linked to the SDGs. So if you like, it reflects Scotland's national plan to achieve the SDGs. It has a purpose at its centre, which is a strategic direction, and that reflects essentially the purpose is about the well-being of Scotland, both social, environmental and economic. Also, which I think is really important in thinking about climate change also, it also has a bit of describes what type of society you want to be, and within that, it recognises the rule of law. When we were doing this exercise, we consulted across all of Scotland, and the thing that people came back with, what was the most important for citizens of Scotland, it was how they were treated. So at the heart of it, there's something about a society which treats people with kindness and dignity.
Gary could have introduced the Scottish National Performance Framework and sort of broadened beyond looking at environment and the climate, talking about social and economic well-being too. I know that you're kind of keen to pick up on the sort of some of the other SDGs as well, particularly looking at issues of financial inclusion in a Nigerian and wider African context. But also, could I ask you both, look at, are we perhaps seeing this through something of a privileged sort of European lens as well? Is there a different perspective, a more global perspective we need to look at this through?
Thank you, and it's a privilege to be here today. Let me step back and make the point that if you look at the stage of development in most African countries today, what is most paramount for us is around inclusive growth. I haven't said that climate is not very important, and I'll come to that shortly. Globally, 4 of the 10 fastest growing economy in the world, they are in Africa. And we are privileged that our principal head office is in Nigeria, which is the largest economy in Nigeria. By far, Nigeria is also the country in Africa with the largest population. The issue has always been, how do you orchestrate an inclusive growth? And that is where an institution like ourselves, we've been in the forefront of promoting financial inclusion. By the way, we see financial inclusion in a much broader sense, and financial inclusion is at least central to our ability as a country and as a continent to achieve at least 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals.
In business, in general, particularly the larger the organization, we tend to put things in boxes. And so for some of the issues we're talking about just now, they initially, I think Omar said, belonged with the PR department and then went into a CSR team. And then perhaps there's a department somewhere that deals with green finance or whatever. But actually what needs to happen in our organizations is that these issues become totally core, totally mainstream. We can't just assume that they're compartmentalized. Another thing that worries me is that particularly in finance, we deal in numbers. We deal in abstractions. That's what our products are. That's what we talk about. That's what capital is. It is removed from reality in some respects. And we don't think about this, but that's what we do. I once said to an entire audience of accountants that numbers are just one interpretation of reality. And the gasp was audible around the audience. But that's all numbers are. They're an interpretation of something. And if we could all learn to bring those back into the world of the real economy, as you call it, back into reality, I think that would help. The other thing that I worry about is we think problems are someone else's problems. So I was really pleased to hear you start off by talking about financial inclusion. That's a sphere and a place that I've spent a lot of my career working on, both in the US and in this country. And, that isn't a problem in the continent of Africa. It's not a problem somewhere else. These are problems all over, and they need to be addressed all over. So I think this probably doesn't answer your question, Simon, but that's typical of me. But I think what we need to do is all of us understand that these are not separable, isolated issues, challenges that are for someone else, that we all have to think about them, learn about them, speak up about them, and have the courage in our jobs day in and day out to talk about them. That's what we can do as individuals and in our institutions.